Hello, everybody, and welcome back to day 4 of evolution. I hope everyone is staying safe in quarantine. Power through, guys. We've got this. All right, so today's aim is how does natural selection result in evolution? Now, if you think back to Mr. Sterling's videos last week, you might recognize two of these words, or two of these vocabulary words. The first one being natural selection. You might have also heard the term survival of the fittest for this. Ooh, my handwriting is atrocious. Bear with me, guys. So when we talk about survival of the fittest, we mean that the organisms that have the best traits are going to survive and pass those on to their offspring. Um, it's the way that nature naturally selects for those beneficial traits. And through this process, it results in a thing called evolution. And we learned last week that evolution is a change in the species over time. So keep in mind that evolution is not something that happens to one organism. Evolution is something that happens to a species over a long period of time. So you won't see it for generations. It's not going to happen immediately. It takes a long time for it to happen. And today we're going to try to figure out how survival of the fittest or natural selection results in evolution or change over time. So before we get started, we've got 3 do not questions for you. Number 1 says, when lions prey on a herd of antelope, some of the antelope are eliminated. Which reason below can be used to describe this situation? Number 1, inheritance of acquired traits. Number 2, isolation of the species. Number 3, survival of the best adapted. Or number 4, Lamarckian evolution. Now, when we say this word eliminated, this is just a nice way to say those antelope were killed. Okay, so this lion came in. Let's draw a little lion. Oh, he's beautiful. It's the best lion I've ever seen. This lion came in and found all of these antelope. Is that what an antelope looks like? Maybe. And let's say that these antelopes, with their long legs, were super fast and they were able to get out of there. Okay, so they ran away, leaving this antelope horribly exposed to this lion. So, what do you think happened to this poor lion? He was killed. May he rest in peace. So we're trying to figure out, why did that happen? What reason below can describe the situation where some antelope were able to get away while others weren't? Now, when we hear the phrase inheritance of acquired traits, remember that this is Lamarck's perspective. And unfortunately, we learned last week that Lamarck's perspective is actually wrong. So I'm going to cross out number 1, because if we watched last week's videos, we should be a master on this and know that Lamarck's views were not correct. They did pave the way for a better understanding through Darwin's perspective, but Lamarck, unfortunately, was wrong. So we're going to cross out number 1, because those antelope didn't acquire those traits through inheritance. Number 2, isolation of the species. Well, while these 2 antelope did leave their friend and isolate him to be eaten by this lion, the species isn't isolated. So that's not going to be the answer either. And we already said that Lamarck's viewpoint is wrong. Remember, inheritance of acquired traits is not correct. So we're going to cross out number 4 as well. This situation is talking about survival of the best adapted. Now, when we say best adapted, you could also say the fittest, the best adapted, or the most fit organisms for that environment. So these antelope that were super fast were able to run away super fast. They were best adapted to their environment, so they survived. Meanwhile, this slow antelope, so probably me in antelope form, wasn't so lucky, and he did not survive. So this is an example of survival of the fittest, where those best adapted organisms, or antelope, are going to survive and pass on those fast traits to their offspring. All right, number 2. Which of the following best describes the term adaptation? This is also a word that we learned last week. Let's see if you guys remember. Number one, it is a process in which an organism adapts to its environment. Number two, it is a step in the process of natural selection. Number three, it is a characteristic or behavior that helps an organism survive and reproduce. Or number four, it causes mutations which lead to natural selection. Okay. Now, a lot of you guys might have automatically chosen number one because we see this word adapts. Um, but unfortunately, number one is not what we're looking for because this term adaptation, we're not talking about a process. We're talking about a trait. Okay. So it's not a process by which something happens. An adaptation is basically a favorable trait that helps an organism out. So I'll write that down, favorable trait. Okay, so what about number two? It is a step in the process of natural selection. Well, I don't have much to say about that. Let's put a question mark. We can come back to it because maybe it's involved in natural selection. We don't know. Number three, it is a characteristic or behavior that helps an organism survive and reproduce. Now, call me crazy, but I think that this phrase, characteristic or behavior, I think we could also replace that with the word trait. And remember that I told you guys that an adaptation is a favorable trait. Okay, so we're looking at this is a type of trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce. Now, if something is helping you survive and reproduce, you might even say that that's favorable. I would like to survive. I'd say that's pretty favorable. Okay, so we're now saying that this is a trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce, which is a favorable outcome. We'll come back to that one. And number four, it causes mutations which lead to natural selection. We haven't said anything about adaptations, which are traits causing mutations. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think the best answer here is going to be number three, because we're talking about a trait that's going to help an organism survive. Okay, so remember, an adaptation is a trait that helps an organism survive. All right, remember, as we go through, please write down any questions you have so that we can answer them later. I lost my stylus, so my handwriting is absolutely tragic today as I'm attempting to write with my finger. Bear with me, guys. All right, moving on to number three. All right, a student noticed that male peacocks have very beautiful and elaborate feathers, while female peacocks were rather plain. He hypothesized that once all peacocks may have been rather plain, but the males with the more attractive feathers were able to reproduce the most and created offspring that also had elaborate feathers. Over time, there were fewer and fewer males, or fewer and fewer plain males, as they were more likely to die without reproducing. Do you think this student's theory of peacock evolution is Darwinian or Lamarckian? Explain your reasoning. Okay, so let's go back and revisit this passage. This student hypothesized that over time, there were fewer plain males. Okay, so we're talking about a long period of time where something's happening over generations. Okay, and he's hypothesizing that all peacocks might have been plain at one point, but the males with the more attractive feathers were able to reproduce the most and create offspring that also had those beautiful feathers. So in this example, we're not talking about an individual peacock. We're not talking about one. We're talking about a change in the species over time. Okay, so change in species. All right, and if we're talking about a change in species and not an individual, are we talking about Darwin or Lamarck? Remember that Lamarck focused on a change in the individual, while Darwin focused on a change in species. Okay, so in this example, we're actually going to be, this is an example of Darwinian evolution. Okay, this student's theory of peacock evolution is Darwinian because it was the peacocks born with more beautiful feathers that were able to survive longer and reproduce more. This was not an acquired trait that was passed on. So really the key phrase here is that this was happening in the species over time. This is not something that happened with one peacock. Okay, so because it's a change in the species and not the individual, we're talking about Darwin here. All right, moving on. So if you do not know this word by now, you absolutely need to. Please write this down on your paper. So natural selection is the process where organisms with favorable traits, and when we say favorable traits, we're talking about better traits, so better adapted to environment. Hope you guys can read that. Favorable traits means better adapted to the environment or better suited for the environment. This is the process by which those organisms with better traits are more likely to reproduce. If those organisms are better suited to the environment, they have a better chance or a higher chance of surviving. And if they have a better chance of surviving, they're going to reach reproductive age in which they can reproduce and pass on those better traits to their offspring. Okay, so that's what I just said. They pass on these traits to the next generation. And over time, remember, this doesn't happen immediately, it happens over a long period of time. This process allows organisms to adapt to their environment. So these are really the key points here. Please make sure you write this down in your paper. Um, Through this process, organisms pass on those beneficial traits to the next generation. And this is what allows organisms to be adapted to their environment. All right, moving on. So we're going to talk about three different factors today that affect or influence natural selection. The first factor that you guys need to know is environmental change. Now, when we talk about environmental change, we could be talking about any sort of natural disaster. So hurricanes, fires, tornadoes, or droughts. All of these things, when they come into an environment or an ecosystem, they're going to disrupt something. That environment is going to change. As a result, those organisms are going to have to adapt to that environment. Um, so here's an example of how that happens. So, for one example, a population of giraffes feeds on leaves of small bushes on the ground and short trees. Suddenly, their environment changes. After a drought, all of the bushes on the ground die. I'm going to highlight that. After a drought, all of the bushes on the ground die. The giraffes are left with only taller trees to eat from. Though some giraffes have necks that can reach these trees or these leaves, others do not. Okay, so here's like me in giraffe form, right? Too short to reach the trees. Um, and here is the other giraffe that can reach the trees. So since all of those bushes on the ground died due to that drought, unfortunately, this short giraffe can't reach the taller trees. So what's going to happen to that giraffe? Well, unfortunately, that giraffe's gonna die because it doesn't have any food source. It can't reach the trees. And remember, Lamarck wasn't right. That giraffe can't stretch his neck to reach the trees. So those shorter giraffes are actually gonna die. Um, but the good news is that these taller giraffes can reach the taller trees and can survive. So I want you guys to brainstorm. How does environmental change affect natural selection? So think about how these short giraffes couldn't reach the trees while these taller ones can. Pause this video, go ahead and write down how does environmental change affect natural selection? All right, I hope you paused it and wrote down an answer. Um, I hope you wrote something similar to this. Environmental change makes it more likely for giraffes to go through natural selection and evolution because those with tall necks will survive longer and reproduce more. So environmental change makes it more likely for natural selection to occur and more likely for evolution to occur because something in that giraffe population is changing, right? Those short giraffes aren't going to reproduce, which means that short gene isn't going to be passed on. But these taller giraffes can survive and are going to pass on that tall gene. So I'm going to write that down. We'll pass on tall gene, which means their offspring are also going to be tall. Okay, so this is going to lead to a change in the species, which means that natural selection and evolution are more likely to occur after environmental change. All right, if you have any questions, please write them down and we will answer them later. The second factor that influences or affects natural selection is competition. Now, when we say competition, we're talking about fighting over resources. Okay, so fighting over resources. And most often you're going to see organisms fighting over food. So that really is the most frequent factor seen in competition, as well as things like land. But in this next example, we're talking about food, my favorite subject. So an example of competition is a population of birds uses their beaks to dig into the soil and find worms to eat. The birds have a variety of beak sizes, but since there was always an abundant supply of worms, all of the birds were able to feed. However, one spring, the worm population decreased dramatically due to a disease, and the birds have to compete over the worms. The birds with the longest beaks were able to dig deepest into the soil and find enough worms to survive. Okay, so remember when we're talking about variation, that word was mentioned here, or a variety of beak sizes, we're talking about differences in traits. So in this example, we've got a variety in beak sizes, meaning that some are going to have big beaks, some are going to have small beaks, etc. Just means that they're not all identical. They're going to be different. I think my face is covering up, but I wrote big. Okay, so they've got big beaks, they've got small beaks. And before this change in worm population, all of the birds were able to eat. They were all good. They were all healthy. But after this worm population decreased, those birds had to compete because there weren't enough worms for everyone. I mean, in this example, we see that the birds with the longest beaks were able to find enough worms to survive, while we can infer that the birds that did not have long enough beaks met a fate like this guy over here. Unfortunately, they aren't going to have enough worms to survive, and those birds are going to die. So once again, using this information, I want you guys to brainstorm, how does competition affect natural selection? So think about how those birds had to compete over resources, and the ones with the longer beaks survived, while those with the shorter beaks did not. Once again, pause this video and write down your answer. All right, you should have said something similar to this. Competition makes it more likely for the birds to go through natural selection and evolution because those with longer beaks are able to survive longer and reproduce more. So once again, this is a factor that increases the likelihood of natural selection and evolution because these birds are going to survive and reproduce, which means they will pass on the long beak trait. Meanwhile, unfortunately, these guys over here are not going to survive and will not pass on their short beak traits. Okay, so these are dead and gone. Yeah, okay. Once again, if you have any questions, please write this down. But once again, with competition, we're going to see an increase in the likelihood of natural selection and evolution because we're going to see a change in these species over time as these beneficial traits are passed on, and these are not passed on. Okay. All right. And moving on to our third type of factor that influences natural selection, and that is our good old friend variation. We've talked about this a lot. Remember the phrase genetic variation? With genetic variation, we're just talking about, like I just said on the last slide, changes in, or not changes, I'll say, let's see, different traits. How about that? Okay, so we're talking about genetic variation, meaning that we don't all look the same. We're all different. We have different traits. And that's actually going to influence natural selection as well. So in the previous two examples, the populations of giraffes and birds had inherent variation, meaning they were different, right? The giraffes had different size necks and the birds had different types of beaks. I want you guys to think about what would have happened if all of the giraffes had had identical short necks, and what would have happened if all of the birds had had identical small beaks. Would the populations have evolved? And when we say they had identical short necks and identical small beaks, we mean that there is no variation. So they're all the same. Okay. So once again, pause this video, take about 30 seconds and write down your answer. What would have happened in these previous two examples? Would those populations have evolved if there hadn't been any variation? All right, bring it back. And I hope your answer was no. Those populations wouldn't have evolved because there were no changes to begin with. So if all of our giraffes were the same, if they were all too short to reach the branches, none of those giraffes would have survived because there weren't any tall giraffes to pass on those traits. All of our giraffes would have died, which means that population is actually going to go extinct, which means they're all going to die, all dead. Meanwhile, because we had variation, these taller giraffes survived and were able to pass on those beneficial traits. Um, so once again, I'm sorry, my roommate's talking to herself. Oh man, okay. Same thing. If all of the birds in the previous example were the same and they all had those short beaks, none of them would have been able to reach the worms, which means they all would have died. And once again, that bird population would have gone extinct. But because we had the variation where some of our birds had long beaks and some of our giraffes had long necks, those beneficial traits were passed on, meaning they get to survive. So this is not on your paper, but I do want you guys to write this down. So somewhere in the margin, somewhere on your Word document, please write this. Describe the describe the relationship between variation and natural selection. So variation is actually what leads to natural selection. If we didn't have variation, natural selection wouldn't happen. Because without these changes within the species, that species can't evolve over time. Okay, so please write down that variation leads to natural selection. And this is what I was just talking about. So with variation, we have natural selection. But if we don't have variation, if there is no variation among species, we actually get what's called extinction. Okay, that would lead to extinction, which means that all of them would die. All organisms, or let me say that species would die. Okay, so without the giraffes with long necks, um, I'm just completely lost my train of thought. Without the giraffes with long necks, the none of those giraffes would have been able to eat, which means that that entire species would have died or gone extinct. Sad day, man. All right, moving on. So here is what would have been pair practice, but you guys don't have partners at home. So we're gonna do this independently. Where is the variation coming from? So you are supposed to circle all the processes below that can result in variation in a population. And remember, when we say variation, we mean different traits. Okay, so let's go through each of these definitions. Okay, so mitosis, we've heard that word before. Remember that mitosis results in identical cells. Okay, meanwhile, meiosis results in different cells, or genetically different cells, I should say. All right. When we hear the word recombination, we're talking about that process. Think back to our genetics unit where the chromosomes were able to exchange genetic information by switching arms with each other. Okay, so it would look something like this. Let's see. Okay, but the main goal there is that we are actually exchanging genetic information. And if we're like shuffling genetic information, that's going to result in changes or different traits. Okay, so recombination, exchanging genetic information. All right, replication. Now, when we say the word replication, we're talking about duplication or making a copy of something. And that copy is going to be identical. Right, asexual reproduction. Remember, we've got one parent, which means identical offspring. Meanwhile, sexual reproduction, we've got two parents, which means different offspring, or let's say genetically different offspring. All right, mutations. Remember that from our last unit, it means a change in the DNA. And finally, last but not least, cloning. Cloning, remember we talked about Dolly the sheep that was cloned. That's when we've got one organism and we're able to exactly replicate it into an identical copy. So we end up with two clones of that sheep. Okay, so once again, cloning, we're talking about an identical copy. So I want you guys to go through this list and figure out which one of these, or which few of these processes would result in genetic variation in a population. So would result in changes or different traits. Hint, the ones where I wrote the word identical, it's probably not it. Okay, so go through these on your own, take about 5 seconds and see what we can figure out. All right, as you went through this, you should have noted that meiosis, recombination, sexual reproduction, and mutations can result in variation. So all of these processes where we talked about genetic differences or changes in DNA are going to result in variation. Meanwhile, the ones where we talked about they're creating identical copies of something cannot result in variation. Okay, so meiosis, recombination, sexual reproduction, and mutation result in this variation or different traits. Right, number 2. A farmer often sprays a certain kind of insecticide, a chemical that kills insects, on his plants to prevent locust bugs from eating all of his corn crops. One day, there was a random change in the sequence of DNA in a locust's egg cell. When the egg cell hatched, the locust was resistant to the insecticide, meaning it would not be killed by it. Since that locust could survive and reproduce, natural selection occurred until the entire population evolved to become resistant. So you are in charge of 2 questions. Number 1 says, identify the variation that existed in the insect population. So what was different about them? And number 2 says, identify the process that created this variation. Okay, so let's look back through this, this passage for number 1. what is the difference, let's say, difference in this passage? What was different about the insect population? Okay, well, if we look at this sentence, this locust was resistant to that insecticide. And eventually, all of those insects became resistant. So the variation that we're talking about here is that some of those insects were resistant to that insecticide versus some were not. Okay, so the variation is resistance versus non-resistance to that insecticide. And the locusts that are going to survive in this example are the ones that are resistant to the insecticide, meaning they can't be killed. All right, and number 2, identify the process that created this variation. Well, if you look back at, I think it's the second sentence, it says that one day there was a random change in the sequence of DNA. If you remember back to our genetics unit, we actually gave you guys a word that describes a random change in DNA. And that word is actually mutation. So there was a mutation in the DNA that created this variation. So the answer to answer B, or question B, is mutation. All right, now we've got a tiny writing passage for you, but don't panic. It's only going to be about 3 sentences. So the question is, a population of bats feeds on flying insects. Some of these bats have a gene that results in much stronger flight muscles than those of the other bats in the area. Explain how this occurrence could lead to evolutionary change within this species of bat. In your answer, be sure to include the concepts of variation, competition, and natural selection. Okay, so you've got 3 terms that you need to identify in this passage. You should mention how variation influenced this, how competition influenced this, and then how natural selection is going to occur. So on your paper, we actually gave you 2 hints. I don't think those hints are on this PowerPoint, but please refer to those hints on your paper to get you started on this. Take about 5 minutes to answer this question, pause your video, and then we'll go over it in just a few minutes. All right, we're gonna go ahead and go over this. So you should have already written your answer. This is a summarized version, so make sure you elaborate on your answer a little bit. But you should have identified that the variation in this passage is the strength of the flight muscles. I actually underlined that if you saw me on the screen. We had a variation in a gene that resulted in much stronger flight muscles. So the variation here is that some of those bats are stronger than others. Okay, competition here, remember we talked about competing for resources, and most often that resource is going to be food. So in this example, our competition was feeding on flying insects. Those bats are going to be fighting over the same food source. And who do you think is going to win, the strong bat or the weak bat? Okay, so then natural selection. This process is talking about that bats born with the bats born with the gene for stronger flight muscles will be able to outcompete bats with weaker flight muscles for flying insects. They will survive longer and reproduce more. So in this example, our stronger bats are going to be our winners, and unfortunately, our weaker bats are going to be our losers, which means that those weaker bats are probably going to die because they're not able to get enough food. So then those, let me circle it, the stronger bats are going to survive and reproduce more, which means that in our next generation, we're going to have more stronger bats. More strong bats. Because our strong bats are able to survive, reproduce, and pass on those strong muscles, or the gene for strong muscles. Right. Once again, write down any questions you've got about this. All right, we've got some independent practice questions. There are about 10 on your worksheet. I'm going to go through the first 4 with you, and then it's going to be up to you guys to complete the last 6 on your own. Okay, so let's see what we're working with here. Number 1, which of the following statements about natural selection is not true? Number 1, natural selection is a process that leads to evolution. Number 2, or letter B, competition for resources can lead to natural selection. C, natural selection can be explained as survival of the fittest. Or D, natural selection is less likely to occur in a changing environment. Okay, so think about what we just talked about throughout this lesson. We're trying to figure out which one of these is not true about natural selection. Okay, so is natural selection a process that leads to evolution? Well, our aim for today was how can we describe how natural selection leads to evolution? So I'm going to go out on a limb and say it does. It does lead to evolution. So let's cross that one out. B says competition for resources can lead to natural selection. Okay, well, we talked about those resources can be things like food. We saw that the birds with the longer beaks were able to survive while the birds with the shorter beaks couldn't. So competition for food does lead to natural selection. That's true. All right. Natural selection can be explained as survival of the fittest. Well, at the very beginning of this video, I told you guys that survival of the fittest is another nickname for natural selection. So that's going to be true as well. Okay, what about letter D? Natural selection is less likely to occur in a changing environment. Well, if you think back to the 3 factors we just went over, we said that any sort of change, so remember we talked about natural disasters, so droughts or hurricanes or tornadoes, any of those things are going to change the environment. And when we have that change in environment, natural selection is more likely to occur because those organisms are going to have to adapt to a new environment. Okay, so the correct answer here is D, because natural selection is more likely to occur in a changing environment, and that is just not true. All right, what about number 2? Moving on. A species that lacks the variation necessary to adapt to a changing environment is more likely to A, develop many mutated cells, B, begin to reproduce sexually, C, become extinct over time, or D, develop resistance to diseases. Okay, so if we're talking about a species that lacks variation, we're talking about the fact that this entire species is actually going to be identical. So there are no changes, or I'm actually going to say no differences. Changes is a bad word. So there are no differences in this species, meaning that they are all identical. Okay, now think back to what we said about the relationship between variation and natural selection. And if you think back to what we said that variation actually leads to natural selection. And remember that we said if there is no variation, this leads to extinction. So they will all die. Okay, so using that information, look at these answer choices again. So remember, variation leads to natural selection. If there is no variation, leads to extinction. So in this example, we said that this species is all identical, so they have no variation. Okay, what's going to happen to them is actually C. They're going to become extinct over time. Because if there aren't any changes, they're not going to pass on any favorable adaptations, okay? Which means that they're going to become extinct. May they rest in peace. Number 3, if an ecosystem is changed throughout a natural disaster, organisms will have the best chance of survival if A, their environment has few abiotic factors, B, the organisms are large, C, the population size is small, or D, their species exhibits genetic variation. Okay, so in this example, we know that an ecosystem is changed, that environment is changing, and we're trying to figure out which organisms are going to survive. Well, are the organisms going to survive if their environment has few abiotic factors? That doesn't seem very relevant. Are the organisms going to survive if they're large? Well, we know nothing about this ecosystem, so maybe that's not the case. Are these organisms going to survive if the population size is small? Who's to say? But let's look at answer D. Their species exhibits genetic variation. Remember what we said, genetic variation, we're talking about different traits. Okay, and we actually just wrote above that whenever we have genetic variation, that's going to lead to natural selection or survival of the fittest. Survival of fittest. Okay, so when a species has genetic variation, that means that the best of the best are going to be able to survive. Now we might have a few stragglers who aren't adapted to that environment and can't survive, but it's okay in the long run because we've had those beneficial traits that are, or let's say, we've had those most fit organisms survive, reproduce, or reach reproductive age, and pass on those fit traits to their offspring. Okay, so an organism or a species, not an organism, a species, guys, I'm going crazy. A species is most likely to survive and evolve over time if that species has genetic variation. All right. And finally, number 4. Which of the following is most likely to result in evolutionary change in a population? Okay, so when we say evolutionary change, we're talking about change over time. Okay, so is it going to be A, a mutation in the eye cell of an organism, B, competition among organisms within the population, C, a lack of genetic variety in a population, or D, a stable environment? Well, let's look at answer A here. Okay, we're told that, or we're said, what? We're given that a mutation in the eye cells of an organism. Okay, well, we know that, what do we know about eye cells? Are those gametes or body cells? Okay, you should know that those are body cells. Okay, expose that. Okay, and are body cells, is the genetic information found in body cells passed on to offspring? No, not passed to offspring. I'm going to use a different color. Not passed on to offspring. Okay, remember that only genetic information found in gametes is passed on to offspring. So if this mutation's in the eye cell and it's not passed on to offspring, is it going to impact future generations? Is that organism going to pass on that mutation to its children? No. And if it's not passing it on to its children, there's no way that there can be any sort of long-term change over time. So it's not going to be A. Okay. What about competition among organisms within the population? Well, remember we talked about competitions when organisms are fighting over resources, so things like food. Okay, and if they're fighting over resources, that means that we're going to have some winners and we're going to have some losers, meaning that those losers are going to die and those winners are going to survive and pass on their traits. So we'll come back to that one. C says a lack of genetic variety in a population. Well, we just talked about if we don't have any genetic variation, then that population is actually going to go extinct, most likely. So a lack of genetic variation would not lead to evolutionary change because that population is actually going to die. And D, a stable environment. Well, if we have a stable environment, that means that nothing is changing. And if nothing's changing, we're not really going to see a change in populations. Those species don't have any need to adapt because they already are. They're already stable. They're already having a great time because everything's stable, everything's normal. It's when we have a lack of stability that leads to long-term changes. So it's not going to be stable environment. It's not going to be C. It actually is going to be B, our competition among organisms within the population. Remember we talked about if they're fighting over food, fighting over food, winners will pass on favorable traits, and our losers are dead, so they can't pass on those favorable traits. Okay, so competition will lead to long-term evolutionary change within a population. All right. So I want you guys to finish the last 6 questions on your own. Please write your answers on your paper and we'll be checking them when you turn them in. As always, if you have any questions, please let us know. I know looking at this screen right now, this is so messy, so I hope you're able to follow along with me. But that's all I have for you today. So happy day, whatever it is that you're watching this. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys later.